You may think an island nation like Australia would be free from border oddities due to it being, well, an island nation. But if you look a bit closer, you'll see Australia is full of border weirdness like anywhere else. But this poses the question, why would Australia have any need for borders? Well, before Australia united into a single country in 1901, the states that are familiar today were separate, self-governing British colonies. As their economies and populations grew in the 19th century, more land was being developed, or allegedly squatted on, hence the need for borders. While these constantly changed in the early years of colonisation, the state borders have essentially stayed the same for the last century. Nevertheless, a rare border change between New South Wales and the Australian Capital Territory, or the ACT, was announced in September 2022 to unify a new development in Canberra's northwest. When you look at a map of the ACT, almost all its wiggly borders were carefully placed to maximise the capital's water supply, this straight line being the one exception. The new border will change this and follow this river here to become a more classic border that can often open up its own can of worms down the line. See the case of Rio Rico or some of the issues in the Balkans for what happens when rivers inevitably change course. With Australia being so big, it's perhaps understandable there'd be the odd hiccup when the borders were drawn up by people who didn't have the most accurate equipment, or were simply trying to survive the hot sun and an army of flies. When Western Australia's borders were surveyed in the 1920s, the state's size made it tough to match up the agreed 129th meridian border to the ground itself. While the WA border looks perfectly straight, there's this 130 metre anomaly here, where the Northern Territory, South Australia and Western Australia meet. Rather than redoing the survey, it was thought the best thing to do was just to have this discreet detour. No one will ever know. But an even stranger state border occurs in the Bass Strait between Victoria and Tasmania. It's not entirely certain who screwed up here. Either way, when Van Diemen's Land, later rebranded as Tasmania, became its own colony in 1825, it took with it the islands in the Bass Strait. This arrangement ended in 1851, once Victoria separated from New South Wales, and a border latitude was set in the strait between the two colonies. While no one either knew or cared at the time, this line went straight through North East Islet, which was later renamed Boundary Islet. And this is where we come to Australia's most bitter border dispute, a blunder that went all the way to the High Court and then on to London. This began in 1836, when South Australia and New South Wales couldn't agree on which river to use between them as a border. Instead, they went for the trickiest option they could, using the 141st meridian. And remember, Victoria doesn't exist at this stage, and would inherited its border from the shambles about to unfold. 70 years of acrimony might have been avoided if people had listened to this man, Surveyor Charles Tyers, whose 1839 mark on the beach was a decent effort considering the instruments of the time. However, he was overruled by this chap, Owen Stanley, who said his mark was too far east. And it was from Stanley's advice that surveyors Henry Wade and Edward White began to draw the border. It took them 2 years and 2 near-death expeditions for Edward White to reach the Murray River. In 1868, another expedition went to set the boundary beyond the Murray, using updated equipment. This Smalley Todd survey found the Wade-White line was 3.6 kilometres west of the new one. While South Australia and New South Wales were happy to shift their borders accordingly, Victoria had other ideas and were in no rush to hand over such a huge section of land. South Australia's efforts to get the land or compensation through the courts were all dismissed. But the weirdness doesn't end there. While the South Australia-Victoria border goes straight through the middle of the Murray River, this changes on the New South Wales-Victoria border, where the border shifts to the top of the riverbank on the Victorian side, with the whole Murray watercourse being New South Wales. Who said a river border only starts trouble after it has changed course? Finally on this list is Australia's border with Papua New Guinea, or PNG, which is one of the world's most innovative and puzzling borders. The arrangements allow Torres Strait Islanders from certain villages to travel freely across the border for traditional activities within the Torres Strait Protected Zone. But this is where it gets a little odd. There is a seabed jurisdiction line between the two mainlands, and a separate line for fishing too. But weirdly, islands within touching distance of the PNG mainland belong to Australia, and are effectively small enclaves that make such arrangements necessary. This is a legacy of Queensland annexing these islands in the 1870s with London's approval. The Queensland government had seen how the islands were pearling hotspots, while London saw this as a way of deterring French and German influence in the region. But why do all these borders matter? Well, during the pandemic, these lines often acted like international borders, as states closed themselves off to the rest of the country. So these anomalies still affect communities 100 years on.